Okay, welcome back to the Oligopoly lecture. We're now going to turn to the issue of prisoner's dilemma. Okay, now we're going to talk about a concept called prisoner's dilemma. So the oligopoly showed that it can be difficult to sustain cooperation. Even if cooperation is desirable, will make all the parties better off, but it can't be achieved through individual rationality. This is really a general feature. There are many settings in which it's hard to sustain cooperation, even though everyone would be better off for that. And the classic example of this is an application of game theory called the prisoner's dilemma. And the prisoner's dilemma is the idea of, well, you have two suspects to a crime, you put them into separate interview rooms, and you make them an offer that if you confess, then you're going to get a reduced sentence. And so you could kind of use this game theory and this idea of prisoner's dilemma to think about cooperation and individual rationality. And so we're going to illustrate this through an example of the prisoner's dilemma. And here, rather than thinking about prisoners committing crimes, I'm going to think about football. So depending on how closely you follow the NFL, recently in the NFL AFC Championship game, there was allegations about the New England Patriots underinflating their footballs. And so this was against the rules. It was cheating, especially because the game was being played in very wet conditions. And it turns out that a football that's slightly softer, not quite as inflated, is easier to grip, easier to throw, easier to catch. And so after the game, there were these allegations. They weighed the footballs. It seemed to be that the footballs didn't have the requisite amount of air pressure. So the NFL is investigating this. And so in my example, I'm going to think, well, there's only two people who know the truth. We'll call them Tom, the quarterback, and Bill, the coach. And so the NFL is trying to get at the truth. And so what they do is they're going to bring them to their headquarters and they're going to put them into separate rooms and simultaneously tell them the following. Okay, right now we have enough evidence to suspend you both for 4 games next season. But we're willing to make a deal. If you confess to underinflating and put the blame on the other, then you can go, you can play, no suspension, but your partner is going to be banned from the NFL. If instead you both confess, okay, we'll appreciate that and we'll give you reduced 4-year suspensions. So the question is, what's the outcome? And so game theory and thinking about what's the individually rational choice can help us answer the question of what's the outcome. And so when we look at prisoner's dilemmas like this and other different types of games in game theory, we usually form the decisions in a table like this. So in this table, the columns are going to be what Bill's decision is. And Bill's decision is either to confess or not to confess. And then the rows, those are going to be Tom's decision. And those are going to be either to confess or don't confess. And then the entries in the table are going to tell us what are the outcomes for each of these scenarios, where Tom confesses and Bill confesses, or Tom confesses and Bill doesn't confess. And so the entries in those are telling what are the punishments. And the first one, the first entry in each cell of the table, that's going to be Tom's punishment. And the second is going to be Bill's. So if we just look at it, we see, okay, well, if they both confess, then we're in the upper left cell. And when they both confess, they get 4-year suspensions. If they both don't confess, then we're in the lower right, and they both get 4-game suspensions. You see, if Bill confesses, so we're in the left column, but Tom doesn't confess, so we're in the lower left, then Bill has confessed, put the blame on Tom, so Tom is banned and Bill walks away. Conversely, if we're in the upper right, then when Tom confesses and Bill doesn't confess, then Tom's putting the blame on Bill. He walks away, but Bill is banned. Okay, so we can look at this and we can think about what Bill's and Tom's decisions are going to be. So let's start with Bill's decision. So Bill just has to decide, am I going to confess or don't confess? And so when he thinks about his decision, he needs to think about and make a guess about what he thinks Tom's going to do. So Bill can sit there and say, okay, I think Tom's going to confess. So if Tom confesses and I confess, then I get 4 years. If I think that Tom's going to confess and I don't confess, then I'm banned. So clearly, Bill is going to decide if he thinks that Tom's going to confess, then he wants to confess also. Okay, so then let's think about if Bill thinks that Tom's not going to confess. So if Bill thinks Tom's not going to confess and he confesses, then Bill gets nothing. He's no suspension at all. If he doesn't confess and Tom doesn't confess, then he gets 4 games. So it's clear if Bill thinks that Tom is not going to confess, that he wants to confess. But we also saw that if Bill thinks that Tom's going to confess, then he also wants to confess. So in either way, doesn't matter whether Tom confesses or doesn't confess, Bill wants to confess. He's better off by confessing. Okay, let's think about Tom's decision. So Tom again is making the decision whether to confess or don't confess. So he has to form a guess about what Bill's going to do. So if Tom thinks that Bill's going to confess, then if Tom confesses, he gets 4 years. If he doesn't confess when Bill confesses, then he gets banned. So Tom wants to confess if he thinks Bill's going to confess. If Tom thinks that Bill's not going to confess, and he goes ahead and confesses and puts the blame on Bill, then he gets nothing. But if Bill doesn't confess and Tom doesn't confess, then Tom gets 4 games. So he's better off for confessing if he thinks that Bill's not going to confess. So Tom, just like Bill, he's better off confessing in both situations. Doesn't matter what Bill actually does, Tom's going to want to confess. And it's the same thing with Bill. His dominant strategy here is to confess all the time. And so what happens is they both confess, and they both get 4-year bans. But they would have been better off if they both didn't confess. If they both just sat there quietly, stuck with their agreement, don't tell him anything, don't confess, just sit there quietly, they both would have had a 4-game suspension. But because that agreement wasn't individually rational, so they think, okay, well, yeah, sure, okay, Bill, yeah, let's not confess. And then you get in there and be like, okay, well, now Bill's not going to confess. I do, he's banned. I get away. Bill thinks the same thing. Okay, yeah, Tom's not going to confess, so I can just put the blame on him, and then I walk away. And so what happens is they both confess, and they're both suspended for 4 years. So that's the idea of the prisoner's dilemma. Of course, you think about this as like police putting people into separate rooms and trying to get them both to confess by telling them, well, whoever the first is to confess gets off. So same kind of idea. But here you see this prisoner's dilemma as an example where the collective behavior would have made them both better off, but it wasn't individually rational. And so the outcome actually made them both worse off. Very much like in the cartel, where they're better off by trying to replicate the monopoly outcome, but it's not individually rational. They want to deviate from it. Okay, well, that's the idea of oligopoly. It's about the incentive to cooperate, but the incentives individual incentives are not to cooperate, to defect on agreements. And we saw that as a pretty general feature. And that concludes the lecture.